In 1964, the adulterous Marxist socialist Martin Luther King Jr. gained enough public support to convince the Social Democrat war hawk president Lyndon B. Johnson to pass the tyrannical, liberty-infringing Civil Rights Act, a law which bans one of the fundamental rights of natural rights theory, the freedom of association. MLK was then assassinated by the FBI, and ever since then, anyone who has ever shown even an ounce of criticism towards this radical and overbearing socialist law gets immediately discredited as a racist.
You said the Civil Rights Act was a mistake. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so the parts of the Civil Rights Act were great, but the way it's now being implemented to force men in female bathrooms to push forward of the trans agenda, the intent of the Civil Rights Act is way beyond what it was originally authored for.
Now, to be fair, not everything about the Civil Rights Act is bad. The parts of this law which prevent the government from discriminating based on race is fine. The government's only purpose should be to enforce natural rights. And in order to do this, the government does have to be colorblind. The problem with the Civil Rights Act is that it doesn't only stop at the government. It goes after private businesses too. Or to be more specific, it goes after property owners. The United States of America was founded upon the principles of classical liberalism. This means that, in theory, our government is supposed to be structured around natural rights, aka the right to life, liberty, and property. That last one being undisputably the most crucial of them all, because without the right to property, all the other rights are impossible to defend. Why do you have the right to life? Well, because your life is your property. Why do you have the right to liberty? Well, because your body is your property and thus, you have the liberty to do whatever you want with it. All human rights are downstream of property rights. So if you care about your rights to life, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, the pursuit of happiness, or anything else, then you better defend the right to property. So while the Civil Rights Act is correct in tackling discrimination from the government, where it oversteps its line is in its complete disregard for property rights. Banning discrimination from private services might seem like a noble cause at first, until you realize this essentially makes the freedom of association illegal. This is a problem in a free society that is structured around natural rights, such as the US. The freedom of association isn't just a side effect of natural rights, it's also an essential defense mechanism of which human societies have used for centuries. Picture this: you've lived in your peaceful village for your entire life without any issues. Then suddenly, a bunch of savages with no regard for the pre-existing culture of your village start moving in and causing havoc. How do you get rid of these savages without violating their property rights? Well, the answer is the freedom of association. Basically, cancel them. Cancel these savages, ostracize them, make fun of them, invent new slurs for them.
You're getting called a slur. I don't know which one, whichever one I feel like saying at the moment. You're getting called a slur.
Get them fired from their jobs.
I'm unemployed. What am I supposed to do now? Do I go home and goon?
And just make coexistence impossible until they either decide to clean up their act and actually try to assimilate into the culture, or they pack their shit and leave. This is how most communities in America used to operate many years ago. The way they maintained their culture and values wasn't through federal laws, it was through the freedom of association. And with all of that said, I haven't even mentioned the real kicker about the Civil Rights Act. Besides that infringing on property rights, the Civil Rights Act hasn't really been effective at doing the thing it set out to do, which was to create racial equality. And there's a reason for that. Racism isn't something you can just legislate away with the stroke of a pen. It's a cultural issue, one that takes time and commitment to change. But it's not impossible to change. We already have a precedent for how an ethnic group can become accepted among greater society. When the Irish first started migrating in droves to the Americas in the 18th century, they too faced heavy discrimination, social stigmas, negative stereotypes, and segregation. They saw all of it. But nowadays, we don't even really call them Irish Americans, we just call them Americans. So what happened? How did the Irish immigrants go from Irish Americans to just Americans? The Irish, using their property rights and freedom of association, created their own Irish communities which encouraged moral behavior, education, and self-improvement. Their hope was that by acting on their best behavior, they could counter negative stereotypes about the Irish. And these efforts paid off. Over time, the negative stereotypes of the Irish started fading away, and soon enough, they began to be accepted by the rest of American society, with the Irish assimilating into American culture while also incorporating some of their own culture into American culture. This process of assimilation is a necessary step that every foreigner migrating to a new land must go through to be accepted. If someone visits your house, you would expect them to follow your rules, and if they don't, well, you can tell them to take a hike. In that same way, you would expect someone moving into your community to adjust to your community's culture, and not the other way around. And the problem with the Civil Rights Act, as well as just affirmative action laws in general, is that they essentially flip the equation so that the burden of assimilation is placed on the natives rather than the foreigners. This is bad for cultural preservation, obviously, but it's also bad for race relations in general. If the foreigners who refuse to assimilate to the new culture are given special privileges to do whatever they want without social repercussions, what do you think that's gonna do to the reputation of foreigners? Even though it might not be all the foreigners, if even just a tiny fraction of them are constantly seen being a nuisance to society, how do you think they'll be perceived by the natives? On the other hand, if we were more of a minarchist country, like we used to be, with a government whose only role is enforcing natural rights, then even if we had open borders, most communities in cities or towns would likely practice the freedom of association, meaning they would only accept individuals who meet their criteria into their communities, including foreigners who prove themselves to be of good moral character. If all the foreigners who peacefully live in your city are of good moral character, and the ones who aren't get physically removed, so to speak, that's likely going to give you a more positive image of foreigners, to the point where you wouldn't even think twice if you see a Mexican man reaching for something in his pocket. So yeah, ironically enough, the Civil Rights Act might have actually increased racism and worsened race relations, as opposed to creating a utopic society free of racism and hatred. And even if it did work just as intended, it would still be bad because it violates natural rights.